The plastic stick felt heavy in Abina's hand, a white and pink death warrant disguised as a miracle, clattering against the cold marble as her heart stopped. These words are described as the sound of a trap snapping shut, raw and terrifying, immediately creating a sense of irreversible consequences and a total shift in power. Abina Afua Chantal stands trembling in the center of the sprawling Gangnam penthouse, her waitress uniform, a symbol of the life she was trying to build, feeling suddenly like a shroud. To the world, Choi Tae-sung is a strategic billionaire, but to her, he was the man who promised safety. But as she looks up, she doesn't find a partner ready to celebrate. She finds a predator who has been waiting for this exact result. Tae-sung leans against the mahogany desk, his white dress shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the dark, curling ink of the underworld on his chest. He doesn't move to comfort her. He doesn't look shocked. Instead, he wears a look of profound, terrifying satisfaction, the look of a businessman who has just secured his most valuable asset. The realization hits her like a physical blow. He isn't surprised because he planned this. Every accident, every coincidence that led to those two pink lines was orchestrated by the man now closing the distance between them. As his large hand settles possessively on her waist, the glittering Seoul skyline behind him feels like a million tiny lights in a cage. When he whispers the words, "You belong to me forever now," the romance dies instantly, replaced by the chilling reality that her body is no longer her own. It is the property of the Choi Syndicate. The bathroom of the penthouse was a cathedral of white marble and gold leaf, yet to Abina, it felt like an interrogation room. Her breath hitched as she stared at the small plastic device lying on the vanity. 2 pink lines. They were vibrant and undeniable, glowing like neon under the recessed lighting. For a fleeting heartbeat, a surge of pure, primal joy warmed her chest. She thought of the humble home she had left in Accra, of her mother's prayers, and of the man she believed had rescued her from the grinding exhaustion of the restaurant floor. This was the miracle that would finally make them a family, the bond that would bridge the vast distance between a billionaire's world and a waitress's heart. With trembling fingers, she tucked the test into the pocket of her black apron and stepped out into the living area. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of Seoul, a sea of flickering lights that usually made her feel small, but tonight she felt infinite. Choi Tae-sung was standing by the window, his back to her. He'd discarded his suit jacket, his white dress shirt straining against the broad set of his shoulders. He didn't turn when she entered, he simply watched her reflection in the glass. "Tae-sung?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I have something to tell you." She pulled the test from her pocket, her eyes searching his for a spark of the warmth she had grown to rely on. "We're having a baby. It happened even though we were so careful. It's a miracle." Chae-sung turned slowly. The joy in Abina's heart didn't just fade, it curdled. There was no shock on his face, no widening of the eyes or sudden intake of breath. He looked at the test in her hand with the same chilling analytical focus he used to review a merger. He crossed the room with a predatory smoothness, his polished shoes silent on the silk rug until he was towering over her. He reached out, his thumb grazing her jawline with a touch that felt less like a caress and more like a brand. A slow, dark smile spread across his face, a look of profound, terrifying satisfaction. "A miracle?" he repeated, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through her bones. "No, Abina, a miracle is an accident. This was a strategy." Abina's world tilted. The heat of her pregnancy was suddenly replaced by a hollow, biting cold. He wasn't reaching for her in celebration. He was looking at her as if she were a prize he had finally caged. "You knew?" she breathed, the realization scratching at her throat. "How could you know?" I didn't just know, Abina, he whispered, leaning down until his lips brushed her ear. I ensured it. I told you once that I never lose what belongs to me, and now you're tied to me in a way you can never undo. The joy was gone, burned away by the realization that the man she loved had been playing a game where her body was the board and her future was the forfeit. Tae-sung's words hung in the air, heavier than the suffocating scent of the lilies arranged in the foyer. Abina stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug, but his hand shot out, anchoring her by the waist with a grip of iron. The warmth she had once mistaken for passion now felt like the cold clamping of a trap. "What do you mean, a strategy?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We were careful, Tae-sung. I was careful. The pills, the protection. You said you wanted to wait. You said you wanted me to have my own life first." Tae-sung gave a small, humorless tilt of his head. He led her toward the leather sofa, his movements graceful and unhurried, as if he were guiding a guest rather than a captive. He sat her down, but he remained standing, a mountain of silk and shadow that blotted out the light of the city. "I said what you needed to hear so you wouldn't run," he began, his tone as detached as a professor's. "You are a woman of spirit, Abina. If I had caged you too early, you would have broken yourself against the bars. I had to let you believe you were free, while I quietly removed every exit." He walked to a small safe, disguised behind a mahogany panel, his fingers dancing over the keypad. When it clicked open, he didn't pull out stacks of cash or gold. He pulled out a small, amber-colored vial, the same vitamins he had insisted she take every morning for her health. "The pharmacy in your neighborhood is owned by a subsidiary of Choi Holdings," he said, holding the vial up to the light. "The supplements were adjusted months ago. They didn't just support your health, they neutralized your birth control. And the protection we used?" He let out a soft, chilling chuckle. "I am a man of detail, Abina. A microscopic pinprick is all it takes to change the course of a lifetime." Abina felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the life growing inside her. She looked at his hands, the hands that had held her so gently, the hands that had traced the maps of her dreams, and saw only the meticulous tools of a saboteur. "You did this to me," she whispered, the horror finally breaking through her shock. "You took my choice. You stole my body." "I secured my legacy," he corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive register. He knelt before her, forcing her to look into eyes that were dark with an ancient, predatory hunger. "You were planning to leave, weren't you? I saw the brochures for the universities in London. I saw the hidden savings account. You thought you could take the love I gave you and use it to fly away." He leaned in, his scent, sandalwood and expensive tobacco, filling her senses until she felt faint. "But now, there is no London. There is no after us. You are the vessel for the Choi heir, and in this country, that makes you mine, legally, socially, and physically. You will never walk into a restaurant as a waitress again, and you will never walk out of this door without my shadow over you." He reached out, his long fingers splaying over her still flat stomach, a claim as absolute as a king's seal on a decree. The architect doesn't just build the house, Abina. He ensures the doors only open from the inside. The transition from his apartment to the estate was not a move, it was an extraction. Before the sun had even touched the glass spires of the city, Abina found herself being ushered into the back of a black sedan with windows so heavily tinted they turned the morning sky to charcoal. She didn't have her phone. She didn't have her passport. She only had the weight of the secret growing inside her and the terrifyingly calm man sitting beside her, his hand never leaving her thigh. When the gates of the Choi ancestral estate swung open, Abina realized the gilded cage was no longer a metaphor. Situated on the outskirts of the city, the compound was a fortress of traditional architecture and modern surveillance. High stone walls topped with discreet electric wiring surrounded acres of manicured gardens, where the only sound was the rhythmic splash of a koi pond that felt like a ticking clock. "This will be your home now," Tae-sung said as he led her through the massive oak doors. The interior was a museum of silent wealth. Maidservants in muted gray uniforms bowed as they passed, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Abina tried to catch someone's gaze, a silent plea for a phone or a window to the world, but they moved like clockwork dolls, terrified of the man whose shadow loomed over her. Tae-sung led her to the master suite on the top floor. It was a sprawling expanse of silk, velvet, and glass, overlooking a private courtyard. On the bed sat a row of shopping bags from the most expensive boutiques in Seoul, soft cashmeres, flowing silks, and maternity wear in shades of ivory and gold. "Where is my stuff, Tae-sung? My books, my pictures from home?" Abina's voice cracked as she surveyed the sterile luxury. "Those things belonged to the woman who worked for tips, Abina," he said, walking to the balcony and checking the lock. "That woman no longer exists. You are the mother of my child. You will wear the best, eat the best, and want for nothing, except the exit." He walked over to a small bedside console and pressed a button. A screen flickered to life, showing a dozen different camera angles of the perimeter. "I have tripled the security, not to keep the world out, but to ensure that our family remains intact. You will find that the guards are very loyal, and the biometric locks respond only to my thumbprint." Abina walked to the window, pressing her hand against the cool glass. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the city where she used to walk freely, where she used to laugh with her coworkers over spicy noodles. Now, she was a high-value asset in a high-security vault. Tae-sung stepped up behind her, his reflection overlapping hers in the glass. He leaned in, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Don't look so sad, Abina. Most women dream of this life." "I didn't dream of a prison, Tae-sung." "A prison has bars," he whispered, his hand sliding up to cover hers on the glass. "A home has protection. You'll learn the difference in time." The silence of the estate was a heavy, suffocating thing, providing far too much room for memory to bleed into the present. Lying on the silk sheets of her new bed, Abina stared at the ceiling and traced the path of her own undoing. She searched for the moment the billionaire's savior had revealed himself as the wolf, but realized he had never truly hidden it. She had simply been too hungry for safety to see the teeth. She remembered the first time he came into the restaurant. She had been exhausted, her feet throbbing after a double shift, when Choi Tae-sung walked in. He didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a dod in a charcoal suit. He had sat at her station every night for a week, ordering nothing but black coffee and watching her with an intensity she had mistaken for fascination. "You work too hard for someone with eyes like yours," he had told her one rainy Tuesday. At the time, she thought it was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. She didn't see the calculation in his gaze, how he was measuring her stamina, her isolation, and her lack of local ties. She had been a girl with no family in a foreign city, and he had swooped in to fill the void. When she lost her previous apartment due to a sudden zoning issue, he was there with a key to his penthouse. When her vis-a-vis hit a clerical snag, he had handled it with a single phone call. Each time she had felt chosen. Each time she had felt loved. Now, looking back, she saw the pattern. He hadn't been solving her problems. He had been creating them to prove he was the only solution. She remembered a dinner months ago when she mentioned wanting to take a weekend trip to Jeju Island with a friend. Tae-sung hadn't flared in anger. He had simply smiled, that calm, detached smile, and said, "I'd prefer if you stayed close. The world is dangerous for someone as precious as you." The next day, her friend had stopped answering her calls. At the time, Abina thought it was a misunderstanding. Now, she realized it was a clearance. He had been pruning her life like a bonsai tree, cutting away every branch that didn't lean toward him until he was the only thing left for her to cling to. "I was a project," she whispered to the empty, opulent room. "A target." She touched her stomach, the weight of the realization heavier than the life inside her. He hadn't fallen for a waitress, he had selected a vessel. He hadn't protected her from the world, he had confiscated her from it. The wolf hadn't stumbled upon the lamb, he had built the fence and waited for her to realize she was inside. The golden cage was not just a physical structure, it was a digital one. Abina waited until the deep, velvet hours of the night when Tae-sung's steady breathing signaled he was finally asleep. Creeping out of the bed, she moved like a ghost toward the study. She didn't need a passport to escape, not yet. She just needed a voice. She needed to hear her mother's rhythmic twee, to feel the grounded reality of Accra through a phone line, to remind herself that she was a human being with a history, not just a billionaire's secret. She found a tablet left on the mahogany desk. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a rib cage. Her fingers flew over the screen, navigating to a social media login. She just needed to send one message. "Mama, I'm in trouble. He won't let me leave." The screen transitioned, but instead of her inbox, a sleek, minimalist interface appeared. A single word sat in the center of the display: restricted. Abina tried again, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried an international calling app, then her email. Every portal to the outside world met the same wall. The internet wasn't down, it was filtered. The estate's network was a closed circuit, a private web where she could browse the world, but never touch it. "Are you looking for someone, Abina?" The voice was like a splash of ice water. She whirled around to see Tae-sung leaning against the doorframe, silhouetted by the moonlight. He wasn't angry. He looked almost disappointed, like a parent catching a child in a harmless but foolish lie. "I just wanted to talk to my mother," she snapped, her fear turning into a sharp, jagged defiance. "I have a right to talk to my family." Tae-sung walked toward her, his bare feet silent on the floor. He took the tablet from her trembling hands and set it face down on the desk. "I spoke to your mother this evening," he said calmly. "You what?" "I told her the news, about the baby, about our engagement." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a high-end smartphone, sliding a video onto the screen. It was her mother, sitting in her small living room in Accra, surrounded by new furniture and high-end appliances. She was weeping, but they were tears of joy. She was holding a thick envelope of cash, laughing as she thanked the generous Mr. Choi for taking such good care of her daughter. "You bought her," Abina whispered, the horror sinking into her marrow. "You bought my mother's silence." "I secured her comfort," Tae-sung corrected, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "She believes you are living a fairy tale. If you call her now and tell her you are a prisoner, she won't believe you. She'll think you're overwhelmed by the pregnancy. She'll tell you to stay with the man who can provide a life she never dreamed of for you." He stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face. "I haven't just cut the lines, Abina. I've rewritten the story. To the world, and even to the people who love you most, I am your savior. And a woman can never be a victim of the man who saved her." The transition from invisible waitress to the most envied woman in Seoul happened over a whirlwind of 4 hours and 3 different stylists. Abina sat motionless as they painted her face and draped her in a gown of midnight blue silk that cost more than her father's house. The fabric was heavy, structured to hide the slight softness of her stomach, cinching her into the role Tae-sung had written for her. "Smile, Abina," Tae-sung murmured, adjusting a diamond necklace around her throat. The stones felt like cold, sharp teeth against her skin. The world is watching, and they only love a happy ending. The gala was held in a glass-domed ballroom that overlooked the Han River. As the doors opened, the hum of Seoul's elite died down for a fraction of a second, replaced by the synchronized clicking of cameras. Abina felt the heat of the flashbulbs and the weight of 1,000 eyes. She wasn't a guest. She was a trophy, a biological proof of Tae-sung's virility and his power to claim the exotic. Tae-sung moved through the crowd with the ease of an apex predator. He kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, a touch that looked like affection to the cameras but felt like a leash to Abina. He introduced her to senators, tech moguls, and men with scars hidden beneath $5,000 suits. "She's breathtaking, Tae-sung," a rival boss said, his eyes lingering on Abina with a look that made her feel stripped bare. "A rare find from West Africa. You always did have an eye for unique assets." "She is my most precious one," Tae-sung replied, his grip tightening just a fraction. "And, like all my assets, she is under total protection." The warning in his voice was clear, but the horror for Abina was the realization of her own isolation. As she stood in a circle of women draped in pearls, she tried to drop hints of her situation. "The estate is very private," she said to a diplomat's wife, her eyes wide with a silent plea. "I haven't been able to leave much." The woman simply chuckled, tapping Abina's hand with a manicured nail. "Oh dear, we all felt that way at first. Enjoy the rest while you can. Once the heir arrives, your life won't be your own anyway. You're the luckiest woman in this room." Abina realized then that in this world, her cage was considered a prize. To these people, Tae-sung's obsession wasn't a crime, it was the ultimate compliment. She looked across the room and saw Tae-sung watching her from a distance, a champagne flute in his hand. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply observing her, making sure she played her part. When the news of the miracle pregnancy was officially toasted, the applause was deafening. Abina stood there, a smile plastered on her face, realizing that the more the world celebrated her luck, the more impossible it became to escape the man who had manufactured it. The gala had been a performance of light, but the return to the estate was a descent back into the shadows. Tae-sung did not speak as he unfastened the diamonds from her neck. He placed them back into their velvet coffin with the same reverence a collector shows for a rare butterfly pinned under glass. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly even. "But I noticed your conversation with the diplomat's wife. You looked restless." "I am a human being, Tae-sung, not a statue," Abina snapped, her hands trembling as she struggled with the zipper of her gown. "I want to know when I can go home, not your home, my home, Ghana." Tae-sung walked over, his fingers replacing hers on the zipper. He slid it down with a slow, agonizing deliberation. "I'm glad you brought up your home, Abina. I've been looking into your father's business dealings in Accra. The timber export company that went under 3 years ago?" Abina froze. Her father's failure had been the shame of his life, leaving her family in a hole of debt that had sent her to Seoul in the first place. "That has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," he murmured, stepping around to face her. He pulled a thick folder from the bedside drawer and tossed it onto the silk duvet. "The predatory lenders your father turned to, the ones who have been threatening to seize your mother's land, I bought their contracts. All of them." Abina felt the air leave her lungs. She scrambled for the papers, her eyes blurred by tears as she saw her father's shaky signature on documents now stamped with the seal of Choi Holdings. "You didn't," she breathed. "I cleared the debt, Abina. Your father is a free man for the first time in a decade. Your brother's tuition is paid through university. I've even set up a trust for your mother's medical expenses." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. "But there is a condition. The debt isn't gone. It has merely changed hands. I am now the sole creditor for the Chantal family." The gift was a noose. Abina looked up at him, her heart shattering. He hadn't just bought her mother's silence with an envelope of cash. He had bought her father's life and her brother's futures. "If I leave you," she whispered, "you'll ruin them." Tae-sung tilted her chin up, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "I would never want to ruin them, Abina. I want them to flourish. But their prosperity is tied to your happiness. As long as you are the devoted mother of my child, they will live like kings. But if you disappear, if you try to take what is mine—" He left the sentence hanging, the silence more violent than any threat. He leaned down, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made her skin crawl. "Don't look at it as a burden. Look at it as a trade. Their freedom for yours. Isn't that what a good daughter would do?" The next week, the estate became a tomb. Abina realized that words were the only currency she had left, and she decided to stop spending them. If Tae-sung wanted a trophy, she would give him a statue. If he wanted a vessel, she would give him a hollow one. She began her fast on a Tuesday, when the gray-clad maids brought a tray of wakye, a cruel attempt to mimic her home. She didn't touch it. When they brought silken soups and imported fruits, she stared through them as if they were made of glass. By the third day, her reflection in the gilded mirrors grew gaunt, her dark skin losing its luster, but her eyes remained fixed in a stony, silent glare. Tae-sung's reaction was not the explosion of rage she expected. Instead, he became a ghost of clinical precision. He sat across from her at the long mahogany dining table, methodically cutting his steak, while she sat before an empty gold-rimmed plate. "The doctor says the baby needs folic acid and protein, Abina. You are not just starving yourself, you are damaging my heir." Abina didn't blink. She didn't utter a sound. She simply watched the clock on the wall, counting the seconds of her own disappearance. She wanted to see if his love could survive her becoming a burden. She wanted to see if the billionaire strategist could negotiate with a vacuum. On the fifth night, the door to her bedroom didn't just open, it was unlocked with a sharp, final click. Tae-sung didn't come in alone. Two men in white coats followed him, wheeling a gleaming chrome stand with a bag of clear fluid. "I gave you the chance to be a partner, Abina, but if you choose to be an infant, I will treat you like one." The men moved with practiced efficiency. Abina tried to fight, but her body was weak from days of fasting. Tae-sung held her wrists down, his grip not painful, but absolute. He watched with a terrifying, detached intensity as the needle slid into her vein, a cold IV drip forced to do the work her spirit refused to do. "You can stay silent, Abina," he whispered as the fluids began to hiss into her system. "You can refuse to speak my name or eat my food, but I will keep you alive. I will keep this child growing. You think you are reclaiming your power, but you are only proving how much you need my care." He sat by her bed all night, watching the drip. He didn't sleep. He didn't look away. In the blue light of the IV monitor, Abina realized the true horror of her situation. Tae-sung didn't need her spirit to be happy. He only needed her heart to keep beating. The clinical atmosphere of the private clinic within the estate was a stark contrast to the velvet cage of the bedroom. Abina sat on the edge of the examination table, the crinkle of the sanitary paper beneath her sounding like the dry leaves of a dying season. For weeks she had treated her body as a battleground, but as the sonographer applied the cold, clear gel to her stomach, a different kind of tension took hold. Tae-sung stood in the corner, his arms crossed over his chest. He had been silent since the IV had been removed, a shadow that never fully retreated. "Look at the screen, Abina," the doctor murmured, her voice a soft contrast to the hum of the machinery. At first, it was just static, a gray, swirling storm of shadows. Then, with a slight adjustment of the wand, a shape emerged. It was tiny, no larger than a bean, but within the rhythmic flickering of the screen, there was a pulse. A steady, rapid drumbeat echoed through the quiet room. Thump, 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 thump. Abina's breath hitched. She had spent so long hating the man who put this life inside her that she had forgotten the life itself. This wasn't a Choi heir or a strategic asset. It was a heartbeat. It was a fragment of her own soul, a piece of Ghana and soul intertwined, fighting to exist in a world that had already decided its fate. A tear escaped the corner of her eye, hot and treacherous. She hated that Tae-sung was seeing it. She hated that this connection, the one thing she should have been able to call hers, was the very thing that bound her to him forever. Tae-sung moved closer, his hand settling on the edge of the table near her hip. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the monitor with an expression she had never seen before. The predatory calm was gone, replaced by a raw, naked awe. For a second, the billionaire vanished, and she saw a man staring at the only thing in his life he hadn't been able to manufacture with money or force. "That is my blood," he whispered, his voice cracking with a rare, terrifying vulnerability. "That is the only thing in this world that is truly mine." Abina looked from the screen to the man beside her. She saw the obsession in his eyes, but she also saw a terrifying depth of devotion. He wouldn't just protect this child, he would consume it, just as he was consuming her. The heartbeat on the monitor felt like a countdown, a reminder that she was no longer just fighting for her own freedom, but for the soul of the child who would grow up in the shadow of a dragon. The peace of the estate was shattered not by a sound, but by the absence of one. At precisely 3 a.m., the constant low-level hum of the perimeter's electric fence died. A second later, the backup generators failed to kick in, plunging the marble halls into a thick, absolute blackness. Abina fed up in bed, her heart mimicking the rapid thump-thump she had heard on the ultrasound monitor. Before she could scream, a heavy, warm hand clamped over her mouth. "Do not make a sound," Tae-sung's voice hissed in her ear. He wasn't the billionaire in the silk suit anymore. He was a shadow among shadows, dressed in tactical black, the scent of expensive sandalwood replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. He pulled her from the bed, his grip bruisingly tight. Outside the heavy oak doors, the silence was punctuated by the muffled thwip, thwip of suppressed gunfire and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. The strategic billionaire was gone. The Mafia king had taken his place. He shoved her into a walk-in safe room hidden behind the master wardrobe. "Stay low, stay away from the door," he commanded. Through the cracked opening, Abina watched as the bedroom door was kicked off its hinges. 3 men in tactical gear burst in, their red laser sights dancing across the silk duvet where she had been sleeping seconds ago. They were not there to kidnap, they were there to erase. Then she saw it. Tae-sung didn't hide. He moved with a terrifying liquid violence that made the air feel thin. He emerged from the darkness like a demon, a combat knife in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. He didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. In a blur of motion, he neutralized the first 2 men with a precision that was more surgical than human. The third man managed to fire a shot, the bullet shattering a vase inches from Tae-sung's head. Tae-sung didn't flinch. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his hand catching the man's throat. Abina watched, paralyzed, as Tae-sung leaned in close, whispering something into the man's ear before snapping his neck with a sickening, casual finality. Tae-sung stood over the bodies, his chest heaving slightly, the moonlight catching the blood splattered across his white shirt.
He turned toward the safe room, his eyes glowing with a feral, protective rage. "They touched my house," he rasped, the calm strategist completely replaced by the butcher. "They tried to touch what is mine." In that moment, Abina's terror shifted. She realized that the protection he offered wasn't a lie. It was a violent, bloody reality. The man who held her captive was the only thing standing between her and a world that wanted her dead simply because she carried his name. He was her jailer, yes, but he was also her only shield.
The aftermath of the attack was a symphony of chaos and screaming sirens. The estate, once a silent tomb, was now swarming with Tae-sung's cleanup crews, men in dark suits, moving bodies and scrubbing blood from the marble floors. In the confusion of the investigation and the frantic securing of the perimeter, the laser focus Tae-sung usually kept on Abina flickered for the first time. He was in the study, his voice a low, lethal growl as he barked orders over an encrypted line, his back turned to the door. This was it, the crack in the armor. Abina didn't take the silks or the diamonds. She took a pair of sturdy boots, a dark hooded jacket she had hidden weeks ago, and the one thing Tae-sung had forgotten to secure in his rage, a set of keys to a nondescript staff vehicle parked near the service entrance. She moved through the shadows of the garden, her breath coming in jagged hitches. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. She reached the service gate, her heart hammering so hard she feared it would wake the dead. The guard was distracted, speaking urgently into his radio about a breach on the north wall. Abina slipped past, stayed low, and slid into the driver's seat of the gray sedan. The engine turned over with a quiet purr. She didn't put on the headlights. She rolled out of the gate and onto the dark mountain road, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the wheel until her knuckles turned white. Seoul Incheon International Airport. The words were a mantra. If she could just reach the terminal, find a sympathetic soul, or get to the Ghanaian embassy, the Choi Empire might not be able to snatch her back in public. As the skyline of the city appeared in the distance, a flicker of hope, wild and dangerous, ignited in her chest. She pressed the accelerator, the wind whistling against the glass. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste like sandalwood and expensive tobacco. It tasted like salt and sweat and freedom. She pulled into the airport's long-term parking, her eyes darting everywhere. She walked into the bustling terminal, blending into the crowd of travelers. She saw the departures board, London, Accra, Dubai. She reached the ticketing counter, her voice a desperate whisper. "One ticket, anywhere. Please, I have cash." But as the attendant looked at her, his expression didn't show the typical customer service smile. He looked past her, his face suddenly draining of color. Abina felt a cold, familiar weight settle on her shoulder. A large, warm hand squeezed the back of her neck, the thumb tracing the line of her jaw with agonizing slowness. "The flight to Accra is delayed, Abina." Tae-sung's voice purred directly into her ear. "In fact, I've decided to cancel it entirely." She didn't even have to turn around to know he wasn't alone. The terminal, which had felt like a sanctuary of thousands, suddenly felt like a stage where every traveler was standing perfectly still, watching her. The airport terminal, once a beacon of escape, transformed into a theater of the absurd. The bustling crowds seemed to freeze in place, and Abina realized with a sickening jolt that the travelers nearest to them weren't looking for gates. They were looking at him. Two men in nondescript suits stepped forward, flanking her, effectively turning the crowded hall into a private corridor for a king. Tae-sung can drag her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned down, his lips ghosting against the shell of her ear as he maintained his possessive grip on her neck. "Did you really think I would leave the airport to chance, Abina? I own the logistics firm that handles the security contracts for this entire terminal. Your face was flagged by the facial recognition software the moment you pulled into the parking lot." He turned her around slowly, forcing her to face him. He looked impeccable, his tactical gear replaced by a tailored black overcoat, though the scent of gunpowder still clung to him like a dark cologne. "I gave you the world, and you chose a terminal floor," he said, his voice a low, vibrating chord of disappointment and fury. "I told you that I would burn this city to find you. Do you think I was being poetic?" Abina looked around at the sea of people. A few tourists looked on with mild curiosity, seeing only a handsome, wealthy man embracing his distraught wife. No one saw the cage. No one saw the predator. "Kill me then," she rasped, her voice breaking. "If I'm just an asset, just take what you want and let the rest of me go." Taesung's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine pain crossing his sharp features before hardening back into flint. He reached out, his gloved hand splaying across her stomach, pulling her flush against his chest. "You are not an asset. You are the heart of my house, and I do not let my heart stop beating." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying final ultimatum. "Listen to me very carefully. If you ever try to run again, if you so much as look at a door without my permission, I will not punish you. I will dismantle the life of every person you ever smiled at in that restaurant. I will revoke the trusts for your brothers. I will ensure your family in Accra wakes up in the street by tomorrow morning. Do you understand?" Abina looked into his eyes and saw the absolute truth of his words. He wouldn't kill her because he loved his possession too much. He would simply destroy the rest of the world until she was all that was left. "Now," he whispered, kissing her temple as the two guards stepped in to usher her toward a private exit. "Let's go home. Our son is waiting for you to rest." The return to the estate was not marked by the slamming of a cell door, but by the soft click of a velvet-lined trap. Taesung did not lock her in a dungeon. He returned her to the master suite, where a fresh bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, scented the air. He treated her not like a fugitive, but like a fragile, precious thing that had nearly broken itself. Abina sat by the window for 3 days, watching the rain wash over the Seoul skyline. She finally understood the futility of her flight. She could not outrun a man who bought the air she breathed and the ground she stood on. To fight him from the outside was to lose everything. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to protect her child from becoming just another piece of the Choi machinery, she had to stop being the prey. On the 4th evening, she didn't wait for the maids to bring her dinner. She dressed herself in a gown of heavy emerald silk and walked down to Taesung's study. She didn't knock. Taesung looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. He looked for the fear, the trembling lip, the silent defiance. He found none. "I'm done running," Abina said, her voice steady, carrying a resonance that made him set down his pen. "But if I am to stay, the terms of my ownership are changing." Taesung leaned back, a flicker of genuine intrigue crossing his face. "The terms?" "I am the mother of your heir," she said, walking toward him with a grace that felt like a weapon. "That makes me the most powerful woman in your world. From now on, I don't want jewels I can't sell or clothes I can't wear outside. I want a seat at the table. I want to know who your enemies are. I want to understand the business that pays for my family's comfort." Taesung stood, closing the distance between them. He looked down at her, his hand reaching out to trace the line of her throat. "You want to play the game, Abina?" "I want to own the board," she corrected, not flinching as his hand tightened. "If I am yours forever, then you are mine. If you want a queen, you have to give her a kingdom, not just a cage."
Tae-sung let out a low, dark laugh, a sound of pure, twisted pride. He realized then that he hadn't just captured a waitress, he had cultivated a consort. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I wondered when you would stop fighting the tide and start learning to swim," he whispered. "Very well, Abina. Tomorrow you sit in on the council. But remember, the closer you are to the sun, the more you have to lose when it sets." Abina met his gaze, her heart cold and calculated. She was no longer looking for the exit. She was looking for the throne.
The wedding was not a union of souls. It was a coronation of power. Tae-sung had spared no expense to announce to the underworld that his precious asset was now his legal wife. The ceremony took place in the estate's private chapel, a structure of cold stone and stained glass that felt more like a fortress than a place of worship. Abina stood at the altar, draped in ivory lace that felt like a spider's web. She was no longer the trembling girl from the restaurant. Her face was a mask of regal indifference, her eyes fixed on the flickering candles. Beside her, Tae-sung looked like a monarch of the shadows, his presence commanding the room of silent, dangerous men and their perfumed wives. "With this ring," Tae-sung murmured, sliding a diamond band onto her finger that was heavy enough to ache, "I bind your life to mine. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is protected by the full weight of my name." As the priest uttered the final blessing, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel didn't open, they exploded. The violence was instantaneous. A splinter group of the syndicate that had attacked the penthouse had found a breach. Smoke grenades hissed, filling the sacred space with a stinging gray fog. Screams erupted as the guests, all of whom were armed, drew their weapons. Tae-sung didn't panic. He didn't even look surprised. He stepped in front of Abina, shielding her with his body before the first bullet even cleared the haze. He pulled a compact submachine gun from beneath the floral arrangements on the altar, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency. "Down, behind the altar," he roared over the deafening cracks of gunfire. Abina dove behind the heavy marble slab, the smell of incense replaced by the acrid stench of cordite. She watched through the smoke as Tae-sung led his men in a counter-assault. It was a massacre. He moved through the pews like a reaper, his white wedding shirt quickly blooming with crimson, not his own, but that of the men who dared to interrupt his claim. When the silence finally returned, it was only punctuated by the distant wail of sirens and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Tae-sung walked back to the altar, stepping over the body of an assassin without a second glance. He reached down, his hand covered in a fine mist of blood, and offered it to Abina. "The ceremony is over," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, as if they had merely finished a business meeting. Abina looked at his bloodied hand, then at the ring on her finger. The white lace of her dress was splattered with red. She realized then that this was the kingdom she had asked for. It was a world where love was inseparable from slaughter, and where her child would be born into a cradle of bone. She took his hand, her grip firm and unforgiving. She didn't look back at the bodies. She looked at the man she had married, the man who would burn the world to keep her, and the man she would now have to rule alongside if she wanted to survive the flames. The cries of the newborn heir shattered the heavy silence of the estate's private medical wing, a sound more powerful than any gunshot or decree Tae-sung had ever issued. Abina lay back against the pillows, sweat-drenched and exhausted, watching as the nurses moved with reverent haste. But they didn't take the child to a nursery. They brought him directly to Tae-sung, who stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark line against the dawn. Tae-sung held the boy with a gentleness that seemed almost alien on a man of his violence. He looked down at the tiny, tawny-skinned infant, the perfect fusion of Abina's Ghanaian grace and his own iron bloodline. For the first time, the billionaire looked truly at peace. "He is perfect," Tae-sung whispered, walking to the bedside and settling the child into Abina's arms. A king for a new era. Abina looked down at her son. She felt the fierce protective surge of a mother, but beneath it was something colder and more calculated. This child was her ultimate leverage. He was the only thing in the world Tae-sung valued more than his own power. She looked up at her husband. "He is a Choi," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the fear that had once defined her. "And he will be raised as one, but he will not be a monster, Tae-sung. I will ensure he learns that power isn't just about cages and blood." Tae-sung's eyes flickered, realizing the shift. Abina wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was stating a fact. The waitress who had trembled in the penthouse was gone, replaced by a woman who had mastered the architecture of her own prison until she owned the keys. "You have grown bold, my queen," Tae-sung murmured, leaning down to press a kiss to her temple. "I grew what you planted," she replied, meeting his gaze with a chillingly calm smile. "You told me I belonged to you forever. You forgot that in a marriage, the ownership goes both ways." Weeks later, Abina sat at the head of the long mahogany table in the council room. Tae-sung sat to her right, his hand resting possessively over hers, but it was Abina who held the folders. It was Abina who directed the flow of the investments into West Africa, and Abina who decided which rivals were shown mercy and which were erased. She was his anchor, his obsession, and his greatest vulnerability. She was his, but as she looked around the room of men who now bowed to her, she knew the truth. Choi Tae-sung had built a world to keep her in, only to realize he had built a throne for her to rule from. The gilded cage was now a palace, and the jailer was now her most loyal soldier.
Do you love Afro-Korean stories? Or beautiful love stories like these? Like this video, share, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more beautiful stories. Your support helps to keep the lights on this channel. Thank you.